Hey there, ready for a deep dive? Today, we're taking a close look at transnational athlete migration.
Yeah, it's fascinating how much the landscape has changed over the past 25 years.
Right. I mean, athletes moving across borders for their sport, it's not exactly new,
Mm.
but you're interested in how this whole system, the good, the bad, the complexities, have evolved, right?
Absolutely. It's gone way beyond just like athletes switching teams. It's at the heart of how the global sports economy works now.
For sure. And one thing that jumped out from your research is this whole talent drain idea, especially when we talk about the global south.
Right.
Athletes heading to wealthier nations makes sense. They're looking for better opportunities. But then what happens to the places they leave behind?
It's a huge question.
Like, think about all those amazing African footballers. They often end up playing for those big European leagues.
Yeah, it's a great example, and it brings up some really, I think, crucial questions. Is this just how a global market naturally works?
Yeah.
Or are we, is there something almost like neo-colonialism at play here? That idea of still benefiting from resources, but this time the resource is talent. To really get a handle on this, it helps to look at how experts think about this whole migration thing.
You mean like those theoretical frameworks I kept bumping into in the articles you sent? They felt a little dense, to be honest.
I hear you, but they can actually be super helpful for unpacking this. Take world systems theory. It basically says the global economy is split. You've got your powerful core, places like Europe, North America. And they often benefit in various ways from places on the periphery, what we often call the global south.
So even in the world of sports, those historical power dynamics, they're still playing out on the field, so to speak.
That's the implication. And then this connects to another theory, labor market segmentation.
Okay.
Think about it. Those elite athletes, the ones with the massive contracts, that's your primary sector.
Right.
And then you've got your lower tier athletes, very often migrants, who are facing way less security. That's your secondary sector.
It's like a smaller version of the global economy itself, but playing out in the world of sports. Makes you wonder, how many of those athletes in that secondary sector came from those periphery countries hoping for a shot, to break into those top leagues?
Totally. And this leads us to a theory I think you'll find really relevant to your deep dive today. It's called post-colonial theory.
Okay.
It essentially argues that we can't ignore the lasting impacts of colonialism. The legacies are still shaping systems today, and that includes athlete migration.
Okay, now we're getting somewhere. But can we make this post-colonial theory thing a little more concrete? Like, how does this actually play out in a real-world sport?
Sure. Let's stick with your example of African footballers going to those European leagues.
Okay.
Post-colonial theory would say this is a prime example of how those historical patterns are repeating. You have talented players who are drawn away from regions that might have developed training facilities. Then they contribute to the success and, let's be honest, the profits of these wealthier nations. And it often leaves a gap in their home countries.
Right, and that's where this whole commodifying athletes thing comes in, right? That phrase kept popping up in my research. What does that actually mean, and why should I, as someone who enjoys sports, care about this?
You're hitting on a really crucial point. Commodifying athletes in this context means essentially treating them like products, bought and sold, often without much thought for, their long-term well-being or what it means for the places they came from.
Wow, that's a lot to think about. It makes you wonder about the human cost of this whole global system. We see those top players in the spotlight, but what about the ones who don't make it? Or the ones struggling in the pressure of it all?
It's definitely a side we don't see as often. And that pressure cooker environment, it can be even more intense for athletes who are navigating a whole new world on top of their sport.
Right, you're talking about the cultural side of things, taking someone from their culture, dropping them into a whole new world to play their sport. It's got to be a huge adjustment.
Huge. Migrant athletes often experience a real clash of cultures. Think about it. New language, totally different training styles, unfamiliar social norms, and all while under this insane pressure to perform. That's a lot.
And I imagine that could be so isolating, especially for young athletes just starting out.
You're right on. That kind of cultural dislocation, it can really take a toll. And we're seeing more and more research on the mental health challenges that these athletes face. Everything from anxiety, depression, to feeling isolated, even burning out.
It's heartbreaking, These are people with dreams, with aspirations, and the system can be brutal. But does the research offer any solutions to these complex issues? Or are we just stuck with this system that can, kind of chew people up and spit them out?
It's definitely not a hopeless situation. There are people and organizations out there trying to make things better. Stronger regulations are a big one. Things like making sure athletes have fair contracts, cracking down on those shady agents we talked about, and creating more transparent recruitment processes.
Are there specific organizations doing that work that are trying to, tackle these issues head on?
Yeah, definitely. So FIFA, for example, has been trying to implement stricter regulations for international player transfers, especially when it comes to minors.
That sounds like a good step. But are those regulations actually effective?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, right?
Right.
Critics will say it's a good start, but there's still such a massive power imbalance.
Yeah.
You think about a small club in Africa versus a giant European club. Regulations alone can't erase those economic disparities. Some people argue that they're not really getting at the root causes.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on, I don't know, a broken bone.
Totally.
Yeah.
Exactly. And we see this debate play out in other ways, too. Remember that whole thing we touched on earlier about athlete naturalization? Athletes switching which country they represent, sometimes for, better opportunities or financial gain.
Yeah, that always feels kind of ethically complicated to me. I don't know. I have mixed feelings about it.
For sure. It's tricky, right? On the one hand, you can understand why an athlete might feel like they have to do that, to switch teams, to have a shot at a better life. But then it also makes you question this whole idea of representing your country when it becomes something that you can just like buy and sell.
Right. It's almost like national identity is being commodified too, alongside the athletes themselves. And I imagine as the global sports economy keeps growing, those tensions are only going to intensify.
That's such a good point.
Yeah.
And as the stakes get higher, so does the pressure on those athletes,
Yeah.
especially those who are coming from more disadvantaged backgrounds.
Hmm.
And it makes you realize that, yeah, we could talk all day about economics and regulations,
Yeah.
but at the end of the day, this is about people.
Right. Your research really highlights the mental toll that this whole system can take. We're talking about the pressure to perform, being so far away from home and support networks, dealing with these constant cultural adjustments. It's no wonder that so many athletes struggle.
It really is like being in a constant state of culture shock on top of everything else they're dealing with. Imagine being a young athlete, maybe still a teenager, taken from everything you know, dropped into this totally different world, expected to perform at this elite level, often while dealing with language barriers and cultural differences. That's a lot to carry.
That's a lot for anyone to handle. So what can be done? How do we support these athletes better so they don't feel so alone?
It starts with recognizing that mental health is just as important as physical health, right?
Absolutely.
Especially in these high-pressure environments like professional sports. We can't just expect these athletes to be, like, invincible robots, on the field and off.
They're human beings, not machines.
Exactly. And they need support systems that acknowledge the unique challenges that they're facing. It's not enough to have, like, a therapist on call, right? It's about creating a culture of openness and support within teams and organizations.
So getting rid of that stigma around mental health, especially in this world of like elite athletics where it's all about, being tough and pushing through.
Totally. And it requires coaches, trainers, teammates, everyone to be able to recognize when someone might be struggling and to create an environment where asking for help is seen as strength, not a weakness.
It's about creating that safety net so that these athletes know that they're not alone. And it's not just about being nice. The research suggests that this can actually improve performance too, right?
Yeah, 100%. When athletes feel supported mentally, culturally, they can perform at their best because they're not being bogged down by this like anxiety, isolation, or cultural misunderstandings. They can actually focus on their sport and reach their full potential.
So it's about seeing the whole athlete, the whole person, not just a passport or, a set of stats.
Exactly. And that requires a much more holistic approach, from recruitment and training to, like you said, cultural integration and mental health support, recognizing that these are human beings, not just commodities in this global marketplace.
Right. We've talked a lot about the challenges, the talent drain,
Wow.
the potential for exploitation, the cultural barriers. But your research also highlights some potential solutions, ways to mitigate these issues. What makes you hopeful?
It is important, I think, to highlight those positive developments.
Yeah.
Because change is possible. We don't have to just accept things as they are.
Right.
We can always do better.
So where do we start? What are some concrete steps?
One area we haven't touched on too much is the role of education, both for athletes and for those within the system.
Okay, break that down for me. What kind of education are we talking about?
Well, on the athlete side, it's about giving them the knowledge and tools to navigate this really complex world. For example, financial literacy is huge.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Because a lot of these young athletes, especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds, they might not have any experience managing large sums of money or dealing with these complicated contracts.
Right, so arming them with the knowledge to protect themselves.
Exactly. And then cultural awareness training. That's important both for athletes who are moving into new environments and for the teams that are receiving athletes from different cultures.
So bridging that divide through education and understanding.
Exactly. And then we also need to educate those within the system, right? Coaches, trainers, agents, team managers. They need the cultural competency and sensitivity to really understand the unique experiences of migrant athletes.
And to recognize that what might seem like a small cultural difference to one person can be a huge barrier for someone who's trying to adapt to a completely new environment.
You got it. Something as simple as like understanding different communication styles or knowing how to provide culturally appropriate support can make all the difference.
Yeah, fostering that sense of belonging so athletes feel seen, understood, and ultimately that benefits everyone involved.
100%. It's about creating that culture of respect, empathy, and understanding within this global sports ecosystem.
Which requires a real shift in mindset, I think, away from seeing athletes as commodities and toward recognizing their humanity, their individual stories, and the sacrifices they often make.
We have to remember that behind every athlete, there's a complex human being with hopes, dreams, challenges. When we approach athlete migration with that understanding, that empathy, it allows us to create a system that's not only fairer, but ultimately more successful for everyone.
It's a good reminder that those values apply to so many areas of life, not just the world of sports. Now, we've talked a lot about making the system better, but are there any current examples of this working well, like places where transnational athlete migration seems to be happening in a more balanced, sustainable way?
There are a few bright spots emerging. Remember how we were talking about how some football leagues, like in South Africa and Nigeria, are starting to hold on to more of their homegrown talent?
Right, they're saying, no to that talent drain.
Exactly. Part of their success involves really investing in those domestic leagues, creating more opportunities for athletes to succeed closer to home.
So they don't feel like they have to leave to be successful.
Yeah, fostering that sense of national pride, of building something meaningful at home. We're also seeing more initiatives focused on athlete development, but beyond just the sport itself.
Oh, like what? Can you give me some examples?
Yeah, so some organizations are starting to provide athletes with life skills training, financial literacy programs, even educational opportunities that can extend beyond their athletic careers.
So preparing them for life after sport,
Mm.
recognizing that, not everyone's going to be playing at that top level forever.
100%. It's about empowering athletes to be successful on and off the field, having options and opportunities available to them once their athletic career comes to an end.
Because let's be real, not everyone can be a global superstar.
You're right. And that's where these holistic approaches come in. It's about ensuring that even those who don't go on to become those elite players still have the skills and the support they need to thrive in life after sport.
Right, because it all comes back to valuing those athletes as human beings, not just commodities. And that's something I think everyone can get behind no matter what.
100%. At the end of the day, we should be measuring the success of transnational athlete migration, not just in medals and championships, but also in the well-being and opportunities afforded to all athletes.
Well said. You've highlighted some positive developments, but are there any specific examples, maybe individuals or organizations that come to mind that are really leading the charge in creating this more equitable and sustainable system?
Oh, absolutely. There are so many. It's actually really inspiring to see. There are so many. It's inspiring to see. One that stands out is this organization called Fight for Humanity. They're doing some incredible work, especially when it comes to combating the exploitation of young athletes.
Fight for Humanity, that's a powerful name. What kind of work are they doing specifically? I'm really interested in how they're tackling that exploitation issue.
They're really multifaceted. So they're working on the ground, educating young athletes about their rights, helping them avoid these predatory contracts, and then they're also pushing for policy changes within these, sports governing bodies.
So it's about giving those athletes the knowledge to protect themselves, but then also holding those in power accountable.
Exactly. Prevention is key. And they've actually had some pretty impressive victories, even getting some notoriously exploitative agents banned from the sports they were involved in. It's a good reminder that these problems are solvable if people are willing to, take a stand.
That is really encouraging to hear. It's good to know there are people out there fighting for these athletes. It's easy to get overwhelmed by the problems, but those success stories, they give me hope.
Me too. And, ultimately, I think that's what it all comes down to. Recognizing the transnational athlete migration is complicated. There are no easy solutions. And it's not always going to be, a feel-good story. But by talking about these challenges openly, honestly, and working together to find those solutions, we can create a system that benefits everyone.
We've covered so much ground in this deep dive. We talked about those theoretical frameworks, which really helped me kind of wrap my head around the complexities of athlete migration. And then we got into the real human stories of the athletes themselves, the talent drain, the exploitation, those cultural barriers that these athletes face. It can feel really overwhelming.
It can. But we also found those glimmers of hope, those individuals and organizations who are out there working towards a fairer, more equitable system.
Right, like Luol Deng, Fight for Humanity.
Yeah.
They're out there making a real difference. And I love how you highlighted that it's not just about criticizing the system, but it's about getting involved and creating alternatives.
100%.
Yeah.
And those stories are out there. I think it's on all of us to learn about them, amplify those voices of change, and support those who are building a better future for athletes all over the world.
You've definitely given me a lot to think about. I guess my question now is, where do we even go from here? What role can we play in shaping the future of athlete migration? Is it about supporting those organizations, advocating for athletes' rights, or even just being more aware of the human side of this whole system?
I love those questions. And honestly, I think it's a little bit of everything. The future of this system doesn't rest solely on athletes. It doesn't rest solely on those big organizations. It's on all of us, right? It's about being willing to learn, to challenge our own assumptions, and then use our voices and actions to create a world where every athlete, no matter where they come from, has a fair shot.
A world where talent can come from anywhere, but so can opportunity and respect. That's definitely something I can get behind.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
No.
Well, I think we did some serious deep diving today.
We did. A huge thank you to our expert for, guiding us through these complex issues. And to our listener, keep those brain gears turning. Stay curious. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.